Okay. Hi, how are you guys doing? Like Nicole said, I'm Bill, and I'm a researcher in the Biodiversity Department. I've been here, almost 6 years now. I started with Tanis years ago, and Tanis works at the museum now. And I study grassland ecosystems, which today I'm going to try and tell you a little bit about grassland ecosystems, and I'll start why there's grasslands. And then I'll talk about all the animals, different types of grasslands, what kind of animals live there. Hopefully you'll get all the pieces. And at the end, I'd like to play a game, if I could, with you guys to try and learn a little bit more about food webs. And so I'll start with just a little bit about who I am. And I like to call myself a wildlife biologist, but my supervisor, who works in academia, likes to call me an ecologist. And my mom likes to call me a scientist, right? Because she doesn't understand any of those things. Most of my friends can get wildlife biologists, but the ecologist and scientist. And so when my mom thinks about a scientist, this is what she thinks about a scientist as. Actually, she doesn't really think of me like that. But she does think of me about like these people. And most people think scientists wear white coats and play with microscopes. And that's not really the kind of science I do, right? So I do science to try and answer questions about the world that we live in on big scales. And then I also do science to try and answer questions about how we impact the world, right? And so this is what my laboratory normally looks like, although Tanis will find me behind a computer most of the time. And so we use lots of different ways to get around. We ski. This is collecting. We were radio tagging and following goshawks and wolverines that I spent doing for a lot of years. On snowmobiles, we can track animals and find out where they go by putting a collar around them with a little beeper. These days, we actually use satellites to follow them around a little bit more than snowmobiles, but there you go. And we can also see things like whales, like this humpback whale, which is actually not far north of here, where I took this picture a couple of years ago. And more where I work is in grasslands. So for my PhD work, we do most of our work in around Kamloops, a place just in the interior, or Kelowna. Has anybody been to Kelowna? You guys know Kelowna? There's a few people around that know Kelowna, where they grow all the wine. And what we do there is we collect plants, some of which are laid out in the front here. These are some of the girls in a greenhouse in Kamloops working with us, and they're sifting out roots out of soil and counting how many roots are in the soil. This is Liz, who's sitting in the front row, fixing nets that we use to keep birds out of different chunks of grasslands, and me raking up the snow to try and just tend the plots that we work on. And so that's mostly how we do our science. And we add those things up, and we write about them, and then we come down and try and talk to people like you about them. And so that we can all learn. And so for the rest of the talk, I'm going to talk mostly about grasslands, and I'm going to start at big scales from around the entire world, and then I'm going to try and focus in down to specific species, like some of the grassland species I have up here in the front, and then we can learn how those things interact. And so this is one of those boring science pictures. But what it says is that grasslands are from places that are hot and dry. Right? And so if we look at all the different types of ecosystems in the world, we can say here that, that we have tropical rainforest in this area, and tropical dry forests here, boreal forests like up in northern Canada, and the Arctic tundra all comes in places that have different temperatures and different rainfalls. And grasslands sit right in this little place. And so they're places that are hot, so they're down into this hot area of our graph, and they're places where they have really low rainfall. And so the plants and animals that survive there are adapted to being hot and dry. And these are the places on the Earth where grasslands occur. So if this is the equator here in the center, and this is Vancouver up here, I work in this little tiny piece right there where Kelowna and Kamloops are. But grasslands occur in all these regions, mostly in the tropical regions, all that big yellow chunk, but also in these places that are dark. And those are the kind of grasslands that we're interested in, because they're most like the grasslands that we have here in British Columbia. They're called temperate grasslands, and they're usually cool places, right? So plants are adapted to, to photosynthesize at a time when there's lots of water, right? And so this is the last little piece. This is hopefully the last nasty data graph that I have. But all it's supposed to show is on the bottom here, we can see 3 graphs from different places in the world. And in some of those places, we can see, in most of those places, in temperate grasslands, we can see that these red dots of temperature coincide with the same bump that you see in water. So when it's warm, there's lots of water around. And that's what's characteristic about the grasslands I study, right? As we get to places that are further south, like this place in Taiwan, China, that's a grassland, we can see that sometimes they don't coincide, and there's periods of really hard drought. And that's more typical of warm grasslands or more typical of desert regions, right? But the grasslands we have are cool grasslands or temperate grasslands. And in British Columbia, there's not very many of them. So where we live, do you guys know where we live? Huh? We live down here in Vancouver, right? And then up here is a long way north, where there's Peace River up here and Fort St. John, and this is Kelowna and Kamloops and Williams Lake. And the red bits are where there's grasslands. And so very little of British Columbia is grassland. It's only about 1%. It's on the furthest, we're on some of the furthest north grasslands in North America. And our grasslands occur here mostly because we have mountains. And we have these 2 big mountain ranges on either side, or that run up and down the province, and our grasslands occur on the east side. So all our weather, water, and stuff comes from this side, and it's dry in the interior, in those interior areas, and that's where we get grasslands in the valley bottoms. This is so for most of South America and North America, this is why we get grasslands. The storms come from the Pacific Ocean, and they come up onto the North Shore Mountains. They drop all their rain and snow, and then when the air goes down the other side, it gets really dry and warm. Right? So when I was talking about grasslands being dry, warm places, it's dry and warm in the interior here. You can see they have grasslands, right? And then on the other side, it's wet and cold, which is where we live in Vancouver. So now a little more fun, a little less data. We can talk a little bit about the different types of grasslands we have. And the interesting part about grasslands that occur in mountainous regions, like where we live, is that we have tons of different kinds, right? So this is a place where I study birds like western meadowlarks, which we'll talk a little bit about later. But this is what we call an upper grasslands or a wet grasslands. And they occur right along the edges of the forest near the tops of the mountains. We have species like rough fescue here. I think they laid out some rough fescue that are formed thick, deep mats of grass. So when I walk through here, I don't even touch the ground, right? I just walk on top of grass, and they create rich, thick soils, right? There's lots of water and cold temperatures, and in the summer, it doesn't get very dry. And as we come down the slope, so if we come down the mountainside, it gets hotter and drier, and we move to areas that are more like this, less trees, except for places in here where there's this is on the north side of a slope where it's a little bit cooler, and so some trees can grow. But we get these large, rich grasslands with pothole lakes filled with water where ducks live, and lots of sparrows and meadowlarks through the top of these things. There's other species but grass in grasslands too, right? So in this picture, you can see that there's these aspen treed areas where we get lots of birds or things go when it's hot during the day. Things like the badger up here or some of the hawk's nest. But what's really interesting about this is all the different flowers and plants we get in those middle and upper grassland areas, right? This is a patch of arrowleaf balsam root. It was a plant that was used by the First Nations in the interior extensively for everything from bug control to making bread, right? So they could boil up the root of this thing and make a bread-like substance out of it, right? Or you could rub the leaves on it to soothe rashes or keep bugs away. So there's lots of different things that you can do with balsam root, and there's big chunks of it in different parts of grasslands. Right? As we move down the slope, we get into those sagebrush ecosystems that you think about when you think, oh, maybe watch a Clint Eastwood movie. Have you ever seen cowboy movie? You guys know cowboy movies, right? There's and so they have there's lots of sagebrush ecosystems. We get more and more of that sage as it gets drier and drier as we go downhill. And the lakes get really different. This one you can't see very well in this picture, but it's a saline lake that dries out in the summer, right? So we get toads like spadefoot toads, and other things that have to burrow into the mud during the summer when it's hot to get away from the heat, and all the water kind of goes away, right? And so what's typical of these drier sites is more sagebrush, or in other parts of the world, other types of shrubs come in when it's dry like that. And as we get close to the valley bottoms, we get even drier places. So places that were inundated with water at the end of the last glacial period, and they have really soft, friable soils. They're super shallow. Here they don't even grow plants in some areas that are really steep. And you can see that there's lots of places, you know, here where you just can't grow grass at all, and there's just spotty shrubs around. You know, it creates these beautiful hoodoo systems that we see along the valley bottoms. And you know, there's still lots of wildlife down there, but not in the abundances as we see at the beginning. And finally, we get to the river at the bottom of the mountain hill. And the rivers again get more trees because there's more water, but we still have these dry pieces leading down to the edges. And along these sort of valleys and the plateaus along the valleys, we'll find things like bighorn sheep, deer that come down to graze near the water. Right? They escape back up into the higher elevations in the winter, or in the evenings, but they come down and feed along these cliffs and valley bottoms. They're incredibly beautiful places in BC. These are photos from just north of Lytton. And so now I'm going to talk a little bit more about all the different things that our grasslands contain, all the different individual species. I've mentioned some of them. Grasslands are really important, and they're more than just the sum of their parts, right? It's all those pieces, all those links of those different species in grassland ecosystems that keep them together. So we have, if we have we have a law in Canada that says certain animals are endangered or threatened, and some animals are secure, right? And so part of what we do as biologists is assess how stable those populations are, how rare certain species are, and how much attention they need from other things. And so in Canada, there's 65 species in BC's grasslands, where 17% of all the species at risk in Canada, those are listed as threatened and endangered, occur in BC's grasslands. In British Columbia, we have 27% of all the species that occur in British Columbia occur in grasslands and are threatened in some way. 407 different species, and even more concerning, at least to people like me, is the declines in the common species that we see. And that's sort of what this graph is trying to show. This is a graph that was published in 2012 called The State of Canada's Birds, and they assessed all of Canada's birds from 1973 till 2010, and they could look at their rough population numbers over time. And you can see this is 0, so the ones that are flat or close to flat are species whose populations didn't change at all, right? So there was as many species of almost as many species of forest birds here in 1973, around the time I was born, until last year or the year before that. And you know, things like waterfowl species are actually on the increase in Canada. But what's worrisome about this graph, at least from a grasslands point of view, are these two lines that drive down the bottom here: aerial insectivores and grassland birds. So birds that eat bugs are aerial insectivores. They hunt bugs when they're flying. And grassland birds are some of the birds that we have out here. And they all have been in steep decline, almost a 50% decline over the last 30 to 40 years. We're uncertain why this happens. This is part of why I study them. But the point of this graph is that grasslands are a really small part of British Columbia, but they are really important for lots of different species in British Columbia, right? And these are some of the species that we're going to talk about. There's two different types of plants in grasslands that are really important. One's bluebunch wheatgrass here on this side, and it's a tall, skinny grass with a really, really deep root system that drives down for it can drive that root system down a long way looking for water. You can see it's just from the picture, right? It comes from places that are hot, big sunny skies, and hardly anything growing around it. And the other type of grass that's all over the place there is this rough fescue, and you can see that the rough fescue creates a lot of litter. It's like it grows up one year and then it falls down and dies, and that holds all the water around the top of the plant and lets it build lots of big, thick soils for it to live in. So both these species are adapted for different types of grasslands. There's also this sagebrush plant. So you can see the sagebrush in the middle, and it's probably the biggest piece of structure in the grassland. So birds nest in it, things hide under it, and it gives shade for lots of different species. And then there's lots of different kinds of flowers that are all over, right? This Mariposa lily, super pretty little thing. This is the arrowleaf balsam root. There's prickly plants like this thistle, and legumes, lots of different kinds. And I talked a little bit about the roots of bluebunch wheatgrass, but you can see that plants affect the soil and they affect the upper. So if this is the ground, all the animals live and they live in this structure in the top, and then plants actually have all this bit underground that they do too, right? And there's a whole different ecosystem down there that I don't study, but that occurs below there. These are prairie plants, but they're often like ours. And what that structure does is give places for things like insects to live. So what's this insect here? Does anybody know what that one is? Do you guys know what that is? You're going to say grasshopper too? Exactly, it's a grasshopper. And what do they eat? What do grasshoppers eat? Do you guys know? Does anybody know? Anything green, they eat grass, right? They don't just hop between pieces of grass, they eat grass. And grasshoppers are called herbivores, right? Because they eat just about all plants. These beetles, they'll eat plants. They're called herbivores too. They also eat dead plants, and so they call those things detritivores. And they also eat these big beetles, eat these small beetles, right? And so they're called predators, right? Ants, on this side, there's ants that live alone. This is one of the pictures out of the museum. It's a really small ant. And then there's these big ants. And there's ants that live by themselves as these little tiny ants, and ants are big ants. Some of them are predatory. Some of them are herbaceous. They eat grass. Herbivores, they eat grass. And some just eat anything. Right? Mostly we call those omnivores. And so I spend lots of time with these cups full of insects collecting them. I also have big nets that I run around and catch grasshoppers with. And the things that eat insects are mostly birds. I have a couple birds out. I also have some mammals that we'll talk about. This little chipping sparrow, they're really neat. They're tiny, little tiny things, about that size, right? And we can compare those to vesper sparrows, which are bigger. And so you can think the kind of insects that chipping sparrows eat are really different than the kind of insects that these vesper sparrows eat. There's also lots of other species. Those are the two common species in our area, but there's other species that live on the edges of those grasslands and the trees and shrubs I talked about, like this flycatcher. So this flycatcher eats mosquitoes. It was actually right beside my campsite, and so it's a nice place to nest, or a nice place for me to camp because he's there eating mosquitoes. Or these woodpeckers that live on the edges of grasslands too, right? And they also come out and eat lots of ants. There's also these fantastic birds. This is my favorite, so that's why it gets its own slide. and it's a western meadowlark, and they're really big. And they have 16 different songs, the western meadowlarks, right? So they're incredibly vocal and sneaky. They're really hard to catch. But they're probably one of the quintessential birds of grasslands. And you can hear them in the early spring. They sing really super loud. There's also lots of mammals that live in grasslands. Does everybody knows what a deer is, eh? And the deer eat grass. Mm-hmm. Do you know what this mouse eats? What's a mouse eat? Cheese. Well, if there was cheese in grasslands, then they would eat it. That's how we catch them. We put cheese out, and they come back. But this one eats seeds, and it eats insects, right? It eats those beetles. This is a vole, a meadow vole, and it's a vegetarian. So it's a herbivore, and it eats mostly plants. So different types of small mammals eat different stuff. This is a marmot. They're rare. They live in rock piles. But they're really pretty, and they eat mostly plants too. Marmots sleep more than they do anything else. There's also lots of other animals. So most of these pictures we take because we don't catch these animals, but we put remote cameras out that can take pictures when we're not there, right? And we can count where they are. There's an American badger here. These guys here. This is a badger just like this one here. And this one looks flat because it's dead. We hope it's dead. But badgers are flat normally. Even when you pick them up when they're alive, they're flat. Right? They have big claws for digging holes in the ground. And they eat those small mammals. We have a coyote, another one of my favorites. We have some coyote skulls up in the front. And coyotes eat mostly small mammals, mice and voles. But if you've ever watched a hungry coyote trying to chase a vesper sparrow, they'll try and eat just about anything. They're not all that successful catching birds, but it's fun to watch. And of course, there's bears in grasslands. People don't think about bears in grasslands. Black bears mostly occur in forested areas, but the bears in the places where I study grassland eat a ton of ants. So bears in BC are mostly vegetarians. They eat about 99% plant material, but they need some protein in their diet. And in the fall, bears often come down into the grasslands and they eat lots of ants, digging up anthills, turning over rocks. Right? If spring comes late, they'll come down hungry in the spring and you'll find them there. That's where we found this guy. But mostly they're vegetarians, other than the ants. The ants we can actually link really closely how many ants are in a bear's diet to how many babies they have. Right? And there's lots of other animals. We have a little weasel like this one here. They turn white in winter and stay brown in summer. We have bighorn sheep, which are around in low densities, and endangered or threatened species like the sharp-tailed grouse, which is kind of hard to see. I guess that's good for the grouse because then it never gets caught by the coyotes. And the sandhill cranes, which you can hear migrating through the grasslands in spring and fall. There's also lots of people in grasslands, right? So we rely on them in lots of different ways. These ranchers have cows, and they graze their cattle through grassland ecosystems. And then there's lots of people that work for conservation in grassland ecosystems. So BC Parks is actually kind enough to let me work on lots of their land. And we still have lots of cowboys that ride around and protect our grasslands, like Kirk Dinsmore here from BC Parks in Kamloops. And they're kind enough to let us go out and study grasslands, so I don't do it alone. I do it with lots of different people, right? So I'm never out by myself, and we can see that we're catching small mammals in tiny little traps, and we weigh how much they are, and we count the plants and try to link that whole ecosystem together, right? And so at the end of that, I think we'll just stop. We'll get to this part. I think that's enough of me talking, and I think we could have a little activity that if everybody wants to stick around, and we can try and build a food web for grasslands. So take